In May 1945, while the entire world was celebrating the end of the war in Europe, while soldiers were hugging strangers in the streets of New York and London, while mothers were crying tears of joy knowing their sons were finally coming home, one American general was sitting in his headquarters in Bavaria, staring at a map and planning something absolutely unthinkable. He didn't want to celebrate. He didn't want to go home. He wanted to keep fighting. But not against Germany, because Germany was already finished, crushed, destroyed, burned to ashes. No, General George S. Patton wanted to attack the Soviet Union, America's own ally, the same country that had just lost 27 million people fighting alongside the United States against Hitler. And he wasn't joking. He wasn't being dramatic. He genuinely believed with every fiber of his being that if America didn't strike right now, while they had the chance, while the American army was still mobilized and supplied and ready for war, Russia would become the greatest threat the world had ever seen. And here's the thing that makes this story so fascinating. He was absolutely right about Russia. Everything he predicted came true. The Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the Iron Curtain across Europe, the proxy wars that would kill millions of people over the next 50 years. Patton saw all of it coming before anyone else did. But what he wanted to do about it would have started World War III, and this time, it might have ended human civilization itself. So, let me tell you the full story of how America's most aggressive general tried to convince his superiors to launch an immediate war against the Soviets, what he said in private that would have ended his career if it had leaked to the press, and what finally stopped him from doing something that could have changed the course of human history. To understand why Patton felt this way, you have to understand what the spring of 1945 actually looked like on the ground in Europe. By April, the Third Reich was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. American forces were pouring in from the west, Soviet forces were pushing in from the east, and every single day the front lines were moving, shrinking, squeezing Nazi Germany into a smaller and smaller pocket. And here's what made the situation so tense. The American and Soviet armies were racing toward each other, and nobody knew exactly where they were going to meet or what was going to happen when they did. Patton's Third Army was moving faster than any army in history. His tanks had crossed the Rhine, smashed through Bavaria, and were now driving deep into Czechoslovakia. His soldiers were covering 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles in a single day. They were capturing entire German divisions that didn't even have time to surrender properly. And Patton was pushing them harder and harder, not because he was trying to defeat Germany faster, but because he was trying to grab as much territory as possible before the Soviets got there. You see, Patton understood something that many American politicians didn't want to admit. The war against Germany was basically over, but the real competition, the real struggle for the future of Europe, was just beginning. Every city that American forces captured was a city that wouldn't fall under Soviet control. Every mile of territory was a bargaining chip for the negotiations that would come after the war. And Patton was determined to give America as many chips as possible, even if it meant bending orders, even if it meant taking risks that his superiors hadn't approved. He pushed his army into Czechoslovakia against direct orders from Eisenhower. He sent reconnaissance units deep into territory that had been promised to the Soviets at the Yalta Conference. And every time someone told him to slow down, to wait, to coordinate with the Russians, he would explode with anger and say that the politicians in Washington had no idea what they were dealing with. And then came the moment that changed everything for Patton. In late April, his forces liberated a Nazi concentration camp called Ohrdruf. It was the first camp that American soldiers had ever seen, and what they found there was beyond anything they could have imagined. Thousands of bodies stacked like firewood, prisoners who looked like living skeletons, torture devices, execution pits, the smell of death so thick you could taste it in the air. Patton walked through that camp, and according to everyone who was with him, the color drained from his face. This was a man who had seen more death and violence than almost anyone alive. A man who had commanded tanks in World War I, who had killed enemy soldiers with his own hands, who had spent his entire adult life preparing for war. And even he couldn't handle what he saw at Ohrdruf. He walked behind a building and vomited. Later, he ordered every American soldier in the area to tour the camp, so they would understand exactly what they had been fighting against. And he forced the local German civilians to walk through as well, to see what their government had done in their name. But here's what most people don't know. That experience at Ohrdruf didn't just fill Patton with hatred for the Nazis. It also filled him with a new kind of fear, a fear about what the Soviets were capable of. Because as Patton saw it, Stalin was no different from Hitler. Both were dictators who murdered millions of their own people. Both ran police states where anyone could be arrested, tortured, or killed for saying the wrong thing. Both were building empires through conquest and terror. The only difference was that Hitler was finished, and Stalin was just getting started. And now, thanks to the agreements made at Yalta, Stalin was about to take control of half of Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. Hundreds of millions of people were going to be trapped behind Soviet lines, and Patton believed that America was making the biggest strategic mistake in its history by letting that happen. So he started talking. At first, just to his staff and his close friends, then to other generals, then to war correspondents. And what he said was explosive. He said that America should keep the German army partially intact and use it to help fight the Soviets. He said that the war shouldn't end until American forces had pushed all the way to Moscow. He said that the Soviets were savages, that they were worse than the Nazis, that dealing with them was like dealing with animals. He said that America would regret every single inch of territory it gave up to Stalin, and that within 10 years, there would be another war in Europe, except this time it would be against Russia. Now imagine how dangerous these statements were in 1945. The Soviet Union was officially an ally of the United States. Soviet and American soldiers were meeting in the middle of Germany, shaking hands, sharing drinks, celebrating victory together. The American public loved the Russians. They saw them as heroic allies who had sacrificed more than anyone to defeat Hitler. Stalin was regularly portrayed in American newspapers as a friendly, reasonable leader, the kind of man you could do business with. And here was Patton, one of the most famous generals in the American military, saying that America should immediately turn around and start killing Russians. The most infamous moment came at a victory celebration in Berlin. The war had just ended, and American and Soviet officers were gathered together for a formal toast. The vodka was flowing, the atmosphere was supposed to be friendly and celebratory, and everyone was making speeches about the great alliance between the two nations. And then a Soviet general raised his glass to Patton. According to multiple witnesses, the Russian general made a toast celebrating the cooperation between their armies, praising the Americans as true comrades in arms, expressing hope that their friendship would continue for generations. And Patton, who was already several drinks in, who had never been good at hiding his true feelings, who had spent the last several months fantasizing about destroying these exact same Russians in battle, raised his glass in return. But instead of giving a diplomatic response, instead of playing the political game like everyone expected, Patton said something that made every American officer in the room freeze with horror. The exact words have been reported differently by different witnesses, but the meaning was clear. Patton essentially told the Soviet general that he hoped they would meet again soon, not as allies, but as enemies, and that when that day came, Patton would destroy him. The room went silent. The Soviet officers looked at each other, not sure if this was some kind of American joke they didn't understand. The American officers started trying to change the subject, to laugh it off, to pretend that Patton had said something else. But the damage was done. Word of what Patton said spread quickly, and within days, it had reached Eisenhower and Washington and eventually the newspapers. And this wasn't even the worst of it, because Patton kept talking. He gave interviews to reporters where he compared the Nazi Party to the Democratic and Republican parties in America, suggesting that ordinary Nazis weren't really that bad and shouldn't be punished too harshly. He refused to follow the denazification orders from Washington, arguing that America needed former Nazis to help run the occupation government and, eventually, to help fight the Soviets. He said, in front of witnesses, that America had fought the wrong enemy, that they should have allied with Germany against Russia instead of the other way around. And finally, Eisenhower had enough. In October of 1945, just 5 months after the war ended, Eisenhower called Patton into his office and relieved him of command of the Third Army. The official reason was Patton's mismanagement of the denazification process, but everyone knew the real reason. Patton had become a political liability. His constant attacks on the Soviets were embarrassing the American government at a time when they were trying to negotiate the post-war order. His refusal to follow orders was undermining military discipline. And his increasingly erratic statements were making people wonder if the stress of war had affected his mental stability. Patton was devastated. The Third Army was his life, his identity, his purpose for existing. Without it, he didn't know who he was anymore. He wrote letters to friends saying that he felt like he had been castrated, that his career was over, that everything he had worked for his entire life had been taken away from him because politicians were too cowardly to face the truth about Russia. And then, just 2 months later, came the accident. On December 9th, 1945, Patton was riding in a car near Mannheim, Germany, when his driver collided with an army truck. Patton was thrown forward and broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21st, George S. Patton died in a military hospital in Heidelberg. He was 60 years old. And here's where the story gets even more interesting, because almost immediately after Patton's death, conspiracy theories started spreading. Some people believed that Patton had been assassinated, that the car accident was staged by American intelligence agencies who were afraid of what Patton might say or do next. Others believed the Soviets were behind it, eliminating a man who had openly called for war against them. There has never been any solid evidence to support these theories, but they have persisted for decades. And some historians have argued that Patton's death was suspiciously convenient for a lot of powerful people who wanted him to stay quiet. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Almost everything Patton predicted came true. Within 2 years of his death, the Cold War had officially begun. Within 4 years, the Soviets had developed their own nuclear weapons. Within 5 years, American soldiers were fighting and dying in Korea against communist forces backed by Moscow. The Iron Curtain fell exactly where Patton said it would. The countries that were handed over to Stalin at Yalta suffered under brutal communist dictatorships for the next 45 years. Millions of people were imprisoned, tortured, and killed. And America spent trillions of dollars and lost tens of thousands of lives fighting Soviet influence around the world. Patton saw all of this coming, and he tried to warn everyone, and nobody listened. So was Patton right? Should America have attacked the Soviet Union in 1945 while they had the chance? Honestly, probably not. The American public had no appetite for another war. The Soviet army was massive and battle-hardened. And by August of 1945, America had the atomic bomb, but the Soviets would have it soon enough. A war between the two superpowers would have been catastrophic beyond imagination. But Patton wasn't wrong about the threat. He wasn't wrong about what Stalin was. He wasn't wrong about the suffering that would come. He was just too aggressive, too impatient, too willing to start a fire that nobody else wanted to burn in. And that's the tragedy of George Patton. He was a man who was born for war, who lived for war, who understood war better than almost anyone who has ever lived. But he never figured out how to live in peace. And in the end, peace is what killed him.